All right, everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Debrief. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. What a week it has been. It's Friday, thank God. We've got a bunch of stories to talk about. The weekend is here, and that means today's episode, we're going to be focusing in a little bit on some of the topics that I feel like have slipped the last 3 or 4 weeks as far as things that we've been talking about. I don't think there's any coronavirus stuff, which is nice. 2 weeks in a row, no COVID. That feel different?
All we need is like 4 more guys to get vaccinated and the whole thing comes off. What are we, 69.99 or something? I mean, we're this close to the governor's 70%.
Yeah, we're getting there. And so with that, we're going to jump right into it today. Bunch of different interesting stories, but one of them is kind of bumping up against a story that we talked about either last week or the week before. There was a report highlighting the 50 lowest paying jobs in the Rochester Finger Lakes area. And surprise, they're the jobs that comprise 60+% of our entire economy. Does this raise a concern about what our economy is based on? Or does it poke a hole in the unemployed people or lazy trope that we keep hearing about over and over again? Servers, think basically any job that falls under the tourism category or the sort of entry-level service area, whether that's retail or whether that's working in a restaurant and that sort of thing.
Well, to me, what it highlights is the disappearance of good-paying manufacturing jobs, and that's been going on for decades. I mean, look at the car business. You know, all these union, and they were union jobs. Union membership has been declining over the years. You could work in an auto assembly plant and make good money and support a family. Now, most of those jobs are done by robots. There are a few supervisors left. We're increasingly seeing an economy that is low-paying service-type jobs. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because it's not going to go the other way. I mean, Bruce Springsteen had it in his song, you know, these jobs are going, boys, and they're not coming back. And that's the case in a lot of places. Where I live in Rushville, the canning factory doesn't can things anymore. Where I grew up in New Hampshire, there used to be 2,000 paper mill jobs where people without any specialized training, nothing more than a high school diploma, could make good money and support a family. Now, today, there's maybe 100 of those jobs. Multiply that by all across America, and we've got a problem. We've kind of forgotten it for the last year and a half because of the pandemic, but now as the economy begins to emerge, we're starting to look at all its shortcomings again.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can sort of look at, and just for full disclosure there, we've linked to the story we've linked to the report in the show notes here, but most of the jobs pay, we'll say, between like $20,000 and $30,000 a year. And the comeback typically whenever I'm having a conversation about this topic with somebody is usually, well, they're not supposed to be forever jobs. Well, if they make up 60+% of your economy, there aren't enough forever jobs to go around, obviously.
Right.
And the other part of this too is, and I've talked to lots of folks who've retired from unions, lots of people who've retired from these large, I'll call them institutional type businesses or corporations that have roots or planted around the Finger Lakes. And the succession chain doesn't look like it did 20 or 30 years ago. I laugh when many of the folks that I hear say, well, young people are lazy, this, that, or the other thing, they don't want to work. They will openly admit that the jobs that they had were filled by people 20 or 30 years younger than them after they retired at a rate half or less than what they were making. So this idea that, it's more of a wage problem, I think, than it is anything else. I'm not exactly sure how you address it other than just straight up raising wages. I think there will come a point where that will quite literally be the only viable path forward, is raising wages, because you can't really have an economy thrive over the long term if more than, say, like 2/3 of your population is only taking home $25,000 or $30,000 a year. You just can't. And I'm not really sure why that's such a difficult thing to admit. And I'm not exactly sure why small business owners end up being so openly opposed to the idea of raising wages. If it means you have to raise prices, that at some point you're not going to have a choice. And if you're raising prices on a moderate level all the time, most of your customers won't really notice it. But there's so many different aspects of this. But I thought the list was really illuminating because it's sort of that wake-up call, right? Like, I'm scrolling through the list, and yes, journalist was on that list, and I'm not going to complain about that. But, you're scrolling through the list, and it's just like, oh, yeah, there's a bunch of those jobs around here. Oh, there's a bunch of those jobs around here, too. And it just kept going and going and going. And there aren't any of those, to your point, the longevity in a lot of these careers, if you want to call them that, if that's what they're going to be, isn't really all that great. I mean, you can be a server at a restaurant, I guess, for 20 or 30 years, but that's if that restaurant is there for 20 or 30 years. These larger, institutional sort of like manufacturing facilities and things like that, they've got more long-term potential than other types of jobs, and they just, like you said, fewer and fewer.
I mean, there's no exit jobs from these jobs that were always thought of as starter positions. I mean, working the old burger flipper, working at McDonald's, that was never supposed to be a job you kept for your whole life. But if there's not a better one out there, then you're going to. And that's the problem, is there aren't the next level jobs up there. And I would guess that overall people are moving less often than they used to. I mean, to take our radio station as an example, when I began, the first radio station I worked at, I was 18, and probably the oldest person on staff was 25 or something. Now our radio station has a bunch of people like me that are in their 60s, and if you're a young guy waiting for that broadcasting break, sorry, buddy, you're going to have to wait until I retire or die.
Right.
There's just not those opportunities for advancement. So, yeah, it's an important question. Can we maintain an economy that has nothing but low-level entry jobs and CEOs and nothing in between?
Yeah, and I think the interesting caveat to what you're describing is, well, it's not only a people working longer problem. It's also a path to training, path to advancement. Call them those feeder systems. They don't exist, and it's like they don't just exist for, say, the 25 to 45-year-old worker, who obviously is feeling quite a burden right now. If you look at millennials in sort of the landscape that they see, but even if you're going all the way down to graduating high school seniors, entering college, or maybe entering community college, or those who are graduating from community college, or just graduating from high school and looking for that opportunity to become something and have a career. I mean, you have lots of folks who say, well, they should become a plumber, or they should become an electrician, or they should become, the path to doing that is not that clear. It's not that like cut and dry. It's not a matter of, well, just go work somewhere and you'll eventually be able to, do whatever it is you want to do. A good example, I guess, would be probably about 2 or 3 months ago, I was having a conversation with a mechanic who's retiring in the Rochester area in the next, he's basically planning his retirement in the next couple of years. He owns his own business, and, he's describing what it's been like sort of seeing the churn in terms of the people who've come to work for him. And, he was sort of blunt about the fact that there hasn't really been anyone who's come along and been that interested in advancing to a point where they could become an owner, they could be the next, the next leader. That's problematic because it's not even on their radar, right? like our system is so broken at the lower level, and he's describing mostly younger people, right? You described it being a lack of seeing a path forward, seeing hope for that younger generation. It's almost like we're not even showing anybody what the map looks like at this point. We're just saying, I'll go figure it out. And, that worked, I think, 20, 30, 40 years ago when the institutions were a little stronger. Your large corporations had a better game plan for how they were going to elevate and move, employees up through their system. But in absence of that, the small businesses don't have it. Small businesses clearly don't have the bandwidth to do it. And on top of that, they can't pay a living wage. So it's like you've got this scenario where the only person benefiting is the sole proprietor and no one else. So, it's a tough situation. Maybe we're going to get to a point where everybody is just a freelancer. Everybody just works a billion side jobs or odd jobs, and that's what our economy looks like, and nobody has an employer anymore.
I think at the end of the day, my theory's always been, I think there's an optimum balance somewhere between the interests of the capitalist and the interests of the laborer. And I think in our society, that balance has gotten out of whack in favor of the capitalist. And I also think the capitalists have gotten a little bit short-sighted. When all you think of is cutting costs, great, you cut costs by offshoring or automating, but every time you eliminate a worker, you're also eliminating a customer.
Yep.
That's what I keep saying about the minimum wage. People scream bloody murder about a $15 minimum wage. If you pay your workers more money, that money will come right back to you because they'll spend it. We're not a nation of savers. We're a nation of consumers and spenders. So if you give your workers more money, they will spend more of it. Now, there's no guarantee it'll be at your store. That's where you have to compete in the free market. And that's the other thing that, interesting related story. I think it's today that the applications open up for this next round of COVID relief.
Yep.
Going to businesses. Well, it used to be if your business didn't make enough money, it went out of business. Now, if you're in business and you don't make enough money, you go to the government and they make you whole anyway. So what's the incentive to be good if you're going to be made whole by the government anyway when business goes down? I mean, in the Great Depression, we didn't pay every business in America that did no business in the late 1920s, early 1930s. We didn't turn around and give them money to make them whole again. They went out of business.
Yeah. Yeah, and the next topic we're going to talk about is sort of connected in that it has to do with that end goal, retirement, right? So a new bill was given approval this past week to give state residents a new retirement option. It would require companies with at least 10 employees who don't already offer their workers a retirement plan to enroll them in an IRA unless the worker chooses not to. Any good, or is this feedback we're hearing from folks about the whole hope or philosophy of retirement? Is this kind of misguided in terms of actually executing? Because again, it seems like an attempt by, in this case, the state government to force these employers to be good, as you say, without actually forcing them to be good, right? Because it seems like this is one of those, if you want to talk about incomplete measures, this is the definition of an incomplete measure. This isn't going to improve the long-term viability of these businesses. It's not going to improve the outlook of these young workers who are looking at the future saying, I have no idea what's going to be 5 years from now, much less 30 or 40 years from now when I can finally retire. Is this one of those useless kind of for show measures, or do you think there's something here?
Well, I don't see the use, because to me, if someone's not in a retirement program, it isn't because they don't want to or they don't want to have money for retirement. If they aren't, it's because they don't feel like they have enough left over after paying for necessities to be able to set aside. And that's not even getting yet into the argument that today's young people, like you say, they're not even thinking in terms of retirement. They're wondering, am I going to be in the same one of those crummy jobs that was listed in the story for the rest of my life? And they don't see anything else. I mean, if you're working in retail or service or one of those low-paying things, what's next? If you're 23 and your manager's 28, It's a long time till that 28-year-old's going to retire. So where is there for you to go? They're just. I think somebody wrote something to this effect that our economy is supposed to be something that serves us, and instead it's become something that we serve. It's a master to all of us instead of something that should be serving our interests.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I kind of chuckled when I read the story because it's like, what good is, an enforced IRA enrollment if all you're making is $25,000 a year? There is this like fundamental issue where, it's easy for folks who entered the workforce 40 years ago and saw their wages, just grossly increase over the last 4 decades, to look at what people are starting at or have started at in the last 15 years and to see how little movement has actually took place and how little movement is clearly going to be taking place in the next 10 to 15 years, and have anything other than basically just a defeated outlook about what's happening, because there isn't too much to see as a possible good outcome here, right? So like, we can talk about wages and minimum wage going up, but if minimum wage getting up to $15 an hour is the quote unquote end result, that's the best case scenario, that's a huge loss for the economy because, right, that pretty much maxes 60% of the population out at earning $30,000 a year. That just isn't, and there's so many other dynamics at play. Young people waiting to start families, waiting to actually get married. Getting married is important, right? Because you can't really do much on a single $30,000 income, but maybe you can do a little more on 2 of them. You've got all these different factors at play that are just slowing down the economy overall, that it's kind of remarkable that, anyone can say, well, the economy is running really well right now.
Let me throw one more thing into the mix, and that is the rise of credit and how much of our wealth is going to banks in the form of interest payments. A generation ago, my father's generation, the only thing anyone ever bought on credit was a house.
Yep.
You didn't even buy, cars, back in the 60s or the 50s when a new car was $2,000 or something, you saved up until you had $2,000, you bought a car. Now we buy cars on credit, we buy furniture and mattresses and bedding on credit, we buy phones on credit. All that money that's going to interest payments is money that could be going into other businesses and then coming back out in the form of wages. Your city banks and your big credit card banks of the world are making billions on interest payments that don't go to any, quote, useful purpose.
Yeah, and that is kind of, I think, a reflection of what's happened with wages, frankly, over the cost of everything has continued going up. Wages have remained relatively flat, unless you want to consider some bumps in minimum wage to be a big boom in wages. The overall earnings of the average person are, relatively the same as what they were 20 years ago.
I think, if I remember correctly, I think the figure I saw somewhere was for the minimum wage to be the equivalent of where it was in, say, the early 70s. Today, it would have to be $27 an hour, I think. Something like that. It hasn't even kept pace even close.
Right, and that, one of the interesting things that I kind of think about from time to time is like, would we not be better off, and this goes back to the innovation question, right? Like, everybody talks about capitalism as being sort of the innovator's economy, but how much have we really been innovating if the overall cost of goods has continued to balloon and not actually get cheaper? Because what is like the number one indicator? You can look at certain portions of, whatever thing you're looking to buy, and you can see examples of prices coming down. Televisions are a great example, right? Like 30 years ago, televisions were like a once every decade purchase, and they could be fixed and all this other stuff. But now they're, flat screen TVs. You can get a 50-inch TV now for like, $200.
I bought a VCR in 1987, I think it was, for $400 and something.
Yeah, and
now, if they even existed anymore, the equivalent a DVD player is what, $19 at Walmart?
Yeah, and that's a reflection, right, of innovation in manufacturing, right, and the advance of technology or whatever the case may be. But we see so many of these other items not be controlled in that same way in terms of cost.
And also, almost none of them are made in the United States anymore.
Correct.
I mean, it used to be when we bought our television, it was a Philco or something like that made in the United States. Now it's almost certainly Chinese or Japanese.
And we saw, I mean, we've seen, and we've talked multiple times now about the housing market and what that looks like here in the Finger Lakes. And, it's almost as if there is a genuine concern about maintaining a better life for the folks who are climbing through the system, it almost seems like instead of paying people more, you should be doing more to control the costs of all of these sort of everyday essentials. And I'm not saying a house is an everyday essential, but if you consider housing to be an essential thing in our economy, then you have to make it attainable by some set of standards for most people. And what we're seeing is actually the opposite, where fewer and fewer people are being herded into this pretty exclusive sort of market. And it's odd because it almost seems to fly in the face of what capitalism has always been.
Well, and it comes full circle, because the part of the premise of the 30-year home mortgage was that during those 30 years, you'd be climbing up the corporate ladder and getting better and better jobs. And again, today's 25-year-old doesn't see that. So they're saying, do I really want to sign up for something for 30 years? Am I going to still be working at my same retail counter job in 30 years, making the same money? How am I going to afford this mortgage?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I just this past week stopped at a couple restaurants just to test the waters in some places that I hadn't been since before the pandemic, and I was actually kind of surprised that one of them was closed, and it was a place that had historically been open every day, and the sign on the door said, we don't have much staff. It's sort of the thing that we've been seeing circulate on social media, right? Like, no one wants to work, unemployment, blah, 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 blah. But look, like, you mentioned the maybe we have too many restaurants problem. And I hate to say it, but like, if you can't afford to pay people a wage that is fitting of them coming back to work, and you can't open, maybe your business isn't that essential after all.
Although, having said that, I still will say that the supplemental unemployment doesn't help, because in many people's cases, it's still more lucrative not to work than it is. Now, that's a whole nother, that ties back to what we've been talking about. I mean, why is it that a relative pittance in unemployment makes you more wealthy than working a job? I mean, that points out something about our whole system right there, that a few $100 in supplemental income is enough to make you chuck your job. I guess that job wasn't that great to begin with then, was it?
Right, and that's, I think that's while that is the typical comeback of what we're seeing play out right now in our economy, the answer is just what you said. I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with the idea that someone sitting home making, $800 a week in unemployment with the boosted numbers, essentially taking home what is like $30,000 a year, is better off than a lion's share of the people who make up 60% of the workforce.
And then at the other end of the spectrum,
kind of insane.
as we've talked about in some of our recent conversations here, in places like Victor and Farmington, $450,000 homes are getting snapped up with people offering $500,000 and waiving the inspection and all that stuff. So I think that gets back to one of the left-right discussions in our politics is about the distribution of wealth. There are apparently a lot of people in that range that can afford to overpay for a $500,000 house. We have a lot of those kind of people, and we have a lot of people that can't afford a decent apartment, and not much in between. And that's, to me, one of the things that made the United States so strong from the end of World War II to today, the baby boom generation, was that growth of the middle class. That when those people came back from war, went back to the factories, made good money, they bought houses, they bought cars, they bought consumer goods, the economy thrived. And now that middle class is being hollowed out to nothing, and you can argue about the causes of it or who's to blame, but you can't deny that that's what's happening. We have a lot of people up here, a lot of people down here, and not very much in between, and I don't think you can build a healthy economy on that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, we're also seeing that. Next topic I want to talk about here is the Geneva City Council meeting, obviously, that turned into pure chaos. Then, of course, the Penfield School Board meeting, which also turned into utter chaos this week. For kind of set the specifics of those two instances aside, I kind of feel like this morning you asked me, what kind of this says about the dialogue between the public and elected officials, or even, I guess, the public versus the public. And I can't help but think that what we're seeing now, that frustration boil over onto those public settings, is essentially a reflection of what we're talking about, right? Like, it's a reflection of people's frustration with an economy that just, whether you think you're on the political right or you think you're on the political left, odds are if your salary looks like a certain thing, your problems are probably pretty mirrored to the person on the other political side of you. Just a fact. That's probably a fair assessment of the situation. So it begs the question, like, what's next for political discourse? Just the idea of debating ideas or trying to come up with solutions. If we're in this zero-sum situation where we're always just going to be saying, well, if they get what they want, then I lose, are we ever going to see any kind of meaningful change? And can these, when we're talking about a city council or we're talking about a school board, are they going to be able to do their work, like the work that they need to do, if this sort of chaos is playing out around them because there's this huge inequity between one group of people and another group of people?
It's going to get harder, and I've been saying on my program, when we write the history books, one of the worst inventions of the 20th century is going to have been the car, because it allowed us to spread out and get farther apart and let small communities fall apart, because who needs little upstate New York villages when you can easily drive 15 or 20 miles to the next community that has a Walmart? In the 21st century, I think that is going to be social media. I think the ability of all of us on Earth to talk to each other and make our opinions known is not necessarily a good thing. And behind the partial anonymity, I mean, it started back in the early days of the internet with message boards where you didn't, on Facebook most people post under their real name and we know who they are. It started with message boards where you maybe had a handle and nobody knew who you were and you could express whatever opinion you want. But we're a world of opinions now, and we all kind of seem to think that ours is the only one that counts. And not only does yours not count, but I don't even want to hear it. So when you express it, I'm going to shout mine twice as loud over you. And now we have the Geneva City Council meeting.
Yeah, and I think, in terms of what a Geneva City Council or what a Penfield School Board needs to do is their job in that situation is to maintain control, right? So shame on, in this case, the mayor of Geneva for not controlling the situation better, and shame on the city for not actually doing something to prevent that from happening. So I think about it this way. Geneva has had controversy for years. This is nothing new. But when a community like that is going through this kind of process, trying to sort out how different people feel about the issues of the day, you've got to put more controls in the situation so that it can't turn into what it turned into this past week, which was...
I agree with that, but also there needs to be some respect. I mean, there was a time in this country, for example, the President of the United States, no matter whose party he was from, you would respect the president as the president. I think that's gone. I don't think the public, if you don't respect the president, then and right now, I mean, we just had a poll the other day that 30% of Republicans think Donald Trump is going to parachute back in and become president here in the next couple of months. You know, in a world like that, where many people question whether the current president is even legitimately elected, how are you going to maintain respect and say, okay, I will listen respectfully to you give your opinion, and then I will respond respectfully with my opinion, and then the council will vote, and if it doesn't go my way, I'll live with it and work harder. I mean, that's, I guess, in a sense, you can take what's happening in these boards back to the presidential election. We had an election in 2020 that many people feel was fair and open, and Joe Biden was legitimately elected. But we have a significant percentage of people who don't think it was fair, don't think it was open, and simply refuse to accept the fact that Joe Biden was the winner. If we've reached a point where we can't even agree that an election took place and who won, how are we going to have decorum in a city council meeting or a school board meeting?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like how are you going to process the situation? I'm looking at it from the where there is control, right? So like ultimately the mayor, the city council should have control over what city council meetings will inevitably
mute
look
some
like.
microphones or throw people out
Right.
if you need to, but you say, okay, when the councilor's speaking, no one else speaks. When the public is speaking, conversely, the counselor can't shout down the member of the public. Take your turn, make your case, and let the other person make their case. But that's increasingly, we see a world in which people don't want the other person to even have the opportunity to make their case. I'm right, you're wrong, and if you try to make your case, I will shout over you so that you can't.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Speaking of something that I feel like will inevitably turn into that, let's talk about this nuisance board in Auburn. It's interesting because we've talked about the sort of rental property issue from like the 500,000 foot level without getting into too much detail, but ultimately, right, the creation of this nuisance board, or the resuming of this nuisance board, because the city of Auburn already had one, is in response to rental properties getting out of hand. Is this something that can really work, you think, on a functional level, or is this something that, like what we just talked about, is kind of destined to become this hot button, this group versus that group issue?
Well, I guess my first question is, or observation is, it would seem to me that there would already be laws in place. And, you know, if the residents are breaking the law, then you arrest them and send them to jail. If the owner of the building isn't conforming with code, then you fine him or do whatever you need to do. I mean, I understand the frustration, and there's one particular property, and it was in the news just again, that has just been nothing but problems, and police get called there over and over and over again. So I guess I'm always a little leery of Band-Aid solutions stuck on top of old solutions that didn't work. If the current laws aren't enough to curb this problem, then what is it this board is going to do? I mean, I know what everyone would like to do is bulldoze the place and be done with it. You can't do that, but it would seem like there's got to be some laws in place that you could use to, if nothing else, make it so difficult for this landlord that he eventually, you know, shuts it down or sells it to somebody better or something. I mean, that's why we have laws.
Yeah, so I think a while back, I believe it was the city of Auburn who was considering essentially some form of local law or zoning ordinance where the city would keep count of what rental properties did and didn't exist in the city. And I feel like this is kind of the same issue, right? Like, you have a city, or you have communities in general, because this is clearly not just an Auburn problem. You have communities that have lost track of landlords, property owners, and as a result, some of these neighborhoods in different communities have kind of gone downhill, and you've got all these issues, whether it be crime or whether it just be kind of like visual stuff. And these communities don't really have any recourse in that process. So it's like, I like the idea of having a nuisance board because it gives the public an opportunity to a way to sort of quickly ship off problems or things that they observe, in the same way that you throw a form on a website and someone can quickly type in what it is they saw that was bothering them. Fast feedback. But at the same time, like you said, if there isn't any real teeth to the legislation, the local law, whatever it winds up being, how much good is it going to do? And at the end of the day, I feel like, and it wouldn't just be beneficial for these community or these neighborhoods that have quote unquote gone downhill. It's also a net positive for, I think, every community to understand where the gaps are in housing, especially in rental housing, because of who is making up the rental housing community. It seems to me like the answer in all of these places is creating a board or giving responsibility to city, town, village employees, databasing exactly what's around, exactly what's there, and being sort of the facilitator in between. Is there an ownership change? Okay, let's note that. Let's get the contact information so the guy who owns the house at 8 Delavan Street, it can, out in California, can actually be accounted for. I don't know if that's actually where the person lives, but it's just the point. That's the kind of scenario we see play out over and over again. It would put a little more emphasis on the local again, as opposed to the not local, which is what the rental market in a lot of these communities has morphed into. And we're even seeing, we're getting ready to launch a housing series here. And one of the things that's been driving up the cost of home prices in the Finger Lakes isn't just people not from the area buying houses. It's people seeing an investment opportunity from other parts of the country, buying up properties and turning them into rental properties. That's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons, but it lends itself to this problem where you don't have that local investment, that real local stake in these neighborhoods, in these houses, in these communities.
Well, and it seems like ultimately it's a landlord problem. So if you have landlords, and they are often absentee, who aren't maintaining their properties decently, then up the fines for code violations, or ban anybody who's had X number of violations from buying a property in the city again. That might be challenged in court. Maybe that's unconstitutional. I don't know. It just seems to me that, like I say, I always worry about when you bolt on a solution on top of one that didn't work. If the current laws you have didn't work, then I'm not sure that your new attempt at the problem is going to work either.
Yeah, and I think, hopping on the soapbox for a minute, like, real legislation is the answer to all of these problems that we're talking about. And I'm locally. I'm not talking about big state, federal policy. I'm talking about every village, town, and city can write whatever local laws they want to. They can institute whatever they want to. It takes work. It takes, legal research, whatever the case may be. Most communities have full-time attorneys and all of the things that they need to get these, real solutions across the finish line. But that's what it comes down to. It comes down to actually doing something, as opposed to saying, oh, hey, we have a problem. We're going to put this very sort of simple, 5-minute solution from 2 decades ago back onto this problem, and we'll forget about it for 9 months until something terrible happens again, and then we'll be back here and we'll do it again.
Well, and it's also enforcement. I mean, if my house catches fire, the code guy is going to come out the next day and take a look and make a ruling whether or not I'm allowed to stay there. So I'm guessing that a lot of these problem properties would dismally fail any kind of code inspection. So why don't they get inspected once a week? You're not up to code, $500 fine. Next week, you're still not up to code, $500 fine. If you make it so it's no longer financially viable to own that slum property, then the slumlords won't want to do business in your town anymore. Maybe that's too simplistic, but it just seems to me, hit them where they live. I mean, the reason we have junky, crummy properties is because owners have decided they can take in rent from the poorest of the poor and not do anything in terms of maintenance. And because it's the poorest of the poor, they're not going to complain because they got nowhere else to go.
Yeah, and it kind of boils down to being a tax problem at that point, as somebody who's watching right now mentioned in the comments. It's a tax problem fundamentally, how we're taxing it, what we're letting landlords get away with. And that's kind of, there still has to be, and this is not to poke a hole in that argument, you can tax the problem in this case, or you can attack it through the way we're taxing land or structures, whatever the case may be. But at the same time, you have to have that active role, like the legislature, whatever that is, whether it's a city council, a board of supervisors, or anything else, a town board, has to be active. And that's what it comes down to. We see a lot of times, city councilors sort of parachute in on these random issues, and it never really seems like there's a cohesive plan to why they're jumping in on this as opposed to that, or why this matters and that doesn't. And we rarely see, as much as city council, like Geneva City Council, for example, does their annual retreat, we rarely see a real structured plan in terms of, okay, these are the things we're going to deal with this legislative year. We rarely see them come out, and we rarely see them come to fruition. So I think it just kind of builds frustration on top of problems.
Right, because as we've said, our system, both our media system for that matter and our government system, are built to handle the crisis of today and not to look ahead and say, you've been saying it time after time after time, and I'll look forward to seeing your series. We have a housing problem, and that's a big issue. Instead of worrying about one address in Auburn, New York, it's a bigger problem all over the place, that people can't find good, decent, clean, safe, affordable housing.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because I can't recall what community it was. It was a village, I think, out in one of the villages out in Ontario County had at some point looked at the prospect of trying to come up with a solution on waiving part of property tax or something along those lines if the homeowner put money into their property, and sort of try to create, and it was interesting because it seemed like the one thing that kept getting in the way was regulation, and regulation kept preventing localities from really coming up with creative plans to address some of those issues. Like, that was more geared toward, let's make all of our properties look nice and pretty, which, doesn't fully address the problem, but at least, starts to.
Well, I think those kinds of market incentives, it's the same thing. Punish the bad landlords financially.
Yeah.
Reward the good. I think that's, we should probably have more of that in our lawmaking and our deliberation in these communities is okay, if we want more of this, then pay people to do this. If we want less of that, then punish them financially to do that. If the free market economy works like we think it does, that'll at least start to solve your problems.
Yeah. Last topic of the day is the story that we talked about this morning on your show, Ted, about the Soda Central School District. Lots of controversy there. I don't really want to go back through and re-explain the story. The story's on our website. We'll link to it in the show notes. But essentially, a letter went out to 40 to 43 students, their families, who were failing 2 or more subjects, middle school students, grades 6 through 8, and were told that there would be mandatory underscore, all caps in the letter, summer school. It's 5 weeks long. Parents and families are just hearing about it now, which is part of the issue, at least. They were also very concerned with the tone that the letter took, which was direct, and even the superintendent in our follow-up story, when I reached out to him and talked to him about some of the issues that had arisen since that letter went out, he admitted that the tone of the letter was a bit blunt, we'll say. That said, it doesn't really seem like the district is going to be backing off at this at all, but what I wanted to ask you and talk a little more about is the variance we're seeing now between district and district and district, failing, apparently holding, at least this is the district's take, holding back students another year, meaning making them go through the 7th grade again if they failed 2 or more classes, is not a viable option, they say. I don't know if that's a universal practice, but according to Superintendent Kais, who we spoke to on Tuesday and then again on Wednesday, there's no state guidance on what districts are supposed to do in this situation, especially coming off of a year and a half of remote learning. So question is this going to start to create some really lopsided outcomes? Is that because to me, that's what it feels like we're going to be getting into. We're going to have seventh graders who may, in SOTUS anyway, may be well prepared come next year because of this 5-week summer school program, although I have some reservations about what 5 weeks can do in terms of catching a student up. Whereas maybe in another district where they're just pushing students along and saying, we'll figure it out down the road, those seventh graders may not match. So, what is this symptomatic of? And then the follow-up to that is there a right solution in this scenario?
Well, as to whether we're going to have unequal outcomes, I think there's no doubt. I think it's going to break along largely socioeconomic lines. I think in a Fairport or an affluent Rochester suburb like that, kids probably did better with hybrid learning and remote learning than in a more poor rural community. The issues here, first off, poor communication on the part of the SOTUS schools. There was no reason that this notification needed to go out in the first or second week of June when people have vacations planned or summer jobs lined up or any number of other things. So that's number one, because it sounds like the policy is well-intentioned in that they're saying, okay, we're going to give these kids some help. I have to applaud them for that. But the communication was poor. And then also another feature that often comes along with public education is that intransigence and never admitting, we kind of screwed this one up. Okay, we're not going to do it. Instead, everybody digs their feet in and say, well, we're going to do it and you're going to like it. And I was thinking about this driving up here. Who works for who? The public education system is there to serve us and to serve our kids' educational interests. I don't think it's there to dictate to us what's going to happen and to say, well, if your kid has a summer job and he goes to it, we're going to punish him next year. And then the punishment, as I understand it, wasn't even necessarily academic. It was more in terms of we're going to take away, extracurricular things or after-school activities. What exactly was the punishment going to be next year?
The letter was vague, which was another part of the problem. The letter just said that there would be a loss of privileges next year, and it even kind of vaguely threatened it the year after that.
So I'm thinking things like sports, for example.
Yeah.
We're going to take away your kid can't play football or soccer if he doesn't go to summer school.
And a, quote, longer school day next year. So what we wound up learning was that was going to mean an extended, basically an after-school program to catch students up, which on its face, if they just said that, probably would have been received a hell of a lot better than what this was received as, because it sounded like you said, students were being told that, or families were being told, well, football, soccer, whatever it is, chess club that your kid participates in is going to be on the chopping block if he or she doesn't go to summer school. Problem is, it's not quite that severe. Again, communication issue, right? It's if this interferes with the after-school activity, they will obviously have to do the makeup as opposed to the fun thing, right?
Well, and where was the discussion? Where was the survey sent out to parents saying, we've all been through a really difficult time. How can we best make sure that your child has gotten everything he needs? Where's the school board discussion? Maybe there was one and just nobody knew, which goes to another issue we won't have time for today, which is the lack of media and the lack of coverage of what our elected officials are up to. But to just suddenly spring that in early June when the school's going to be over in a week or so just strikes me as not very well thought out. And again, having said that, I applaud what I assume is the spirit of the idea, which is we recognize that we haven't been able to do all that we would have liked during this pandemic. Therefore, we want to do something more. They should be applauded for that. It's just the execution of it fell flat.
Yeah, and I think to partly answer that question, I don't think it ever got to the school board. I don't think that was ever something that went that high. It sounds like it was pretty much a decision made within administration and at the building level, because this is a policy just for middle school students, no one else. Which again, it just creates these, if these were the rules, or if this were the expectation for students at all levels, families across the board, and this were communicated in September, or even January.
Yeah.
I'd have no problem with how this was executed. But like you said, even if even if a quote unquote first warning letter, and I don't know how many warning letters there were, it was made clear to me that this was a warning letter that was simply sent out to remind families of what was going to happen. Now, I don't know if that means it was vaguely mentioned at some point before that, but clearly not enough for any of these families to know. It kind of boils down to, you're too late now, right? Like you're too late. You can't create this. You can't create this now. You can say that you have the infrastructure to make it happen, but announcing it in the beginning of June or late May,
it ignores the reality of life in the 21st century. I mean, some of these kids are probably going to have jobs lined up. Some of them have family vacations planned. And I'm with you. If you announce it early in the year, then okay, you knew about it. You chose, or your child chose, not to do the effort required. So I got no problem. And the other question that I have is why isn't holding students back feasible? And I don't have any idea if this is the case or not, but my perception is that holding students back is something that was far more common when I was young than it is today. Right. I remember that happening with kids in my school. I don't think that happens very much today, partly because I don't think the schools want to deal with irate parents who are going to come screaming in with, both barrels blazing. Why is my kid being held back? And
the cynic in me tells me that that's a numbers game. That is simply a matter of the school is ultimately able to reflect a student moving forward, as opposed to a student being stuck in place.
And that's part of the problem when we measure schools by things like graduation rate. What does that do to the quality of the education? If I'm a school and I'm rated according to my graduation rate, then I'm making sure everybody graduates, whether they deserve to or not. If that's the standard you're holding me to, don't blame me for teaching to it or designing my rules to it. That's a problem right there, is when the incentive is for schools to pass kids through whether they deserve it or not. And that is the incentive right now, because that is how the state and other people measure them.
Yeah, it's complicated for sure. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Geneva, that's 106.3. It's getting harder to remember these. 106.3 and 1240 WGVA. In Auburn, it's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Give Ted a listen Monday through Friday and join us back here next week. We'll see you then.